everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you don't know me yet, I'm Pat Ripley. I'm the Executive Director at the Lamoille County Development Corporation. We're one of 12 regional development centers in the state. We also run the local Chamber of Commerce out of our office, so Lamoille Chamber of Commerce, which we kind of use to sponsor these legislative type events. We do have our regular legislative breakfast coming up starting in January. It's not, last year we did it the day before the session starts. This week it's the first Monday of January, which I cannot remember what that date is at the moment. Nonetheless, if you get our emails and whatnot, you'll hear about it a lot over the next coming months, and hopefully we'll see you there. I'll let our speakers introduce themselves, but just some housekeeping stuff. The bathroom is in the back. You go straight through the glass doors. You keep going straight leftish, and you'll find the bathrooms. Coffee, all of the pastries you could ever want, please take them. We expected about twice as many people here today, but I guess the roads or whatever, folks stayed home. So there are also, if you're looking to where to put your plates, just put them underneath when you're done with them. There's a little bin under there. As much coffee as you want, take one to go. There's some bags as well if there's pastries left over, which I suspect there will be. So fill up a bag and bring them home with you. And that's about all I had. I'll pass it along.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to stand up over here. Hopefully that will be fine, just because that way we won't be in front of this. I'm Betsy Bishop with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. I understand that there were supposed to be more people here, and apparently they couldn't drive as far as I had to get here. So I came from East Montpelier this morning, up Route 12. Really bad from Worcester to like Elmore, of course, right? Because that's where there's no reception, there's no other people, it's fine. But Morrisville's great, so it was easy. So good to be here. It took about an hour and 10 minutes to get here. I see the Lieutenant Governor here, and I said, what are you doing out in this neck of the woods? And he said, it was on my way back from my morning delivery in Montpelier. And I'm like, no. It's not the way I would go back, but okay. So good. I think we all get credit for driving on the roads and getting here. So I'm the president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. I've been doing this work for a long time. When I enter the State House in January, it'll be my 30th year working on policy in Vermont. So while I'm not elected, I do get a great ability to begin to work to move policy, and my whole goal has always been to advance the Vermont economy. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the economic issues before the legislature, the things that are on our agenda. Today with me is Megan Sullivan, our Vice President of Government Affairs, who is sort of a housing expert, so we'll get into that issue a little bit too. And I'm just curious if we have anybody here willing to be our social media experts for the day. Megan and I did not plan this, but we're wearing matching outfits. And if anybody would like to take a picture of us presenting in matching outfits, I'm pretty sure that would go Vermont viral. So when I walked in and she said to me, oh dear, should I go and get like a scarf or something? It's fine, it's fine. So really our mission at the Vermont Chamber is to advance the Vermont economy. And when we think about what we're going to do and how we're going to do that, housing is really at the top of the list. And we're going to talk a lot about that and talk about how we can do that and why that really contributes to sort of one of our priorities this year is business success. Business success, business resiliency, especially in the time of climate change and the recent flooding that we've seen. It's just been pretty incredible. So we're going to talk a little bit about business resiliency as well. So I see we're looking at the team. I can barely see it from up here. Hopefully the visuals are better there.
Can we bring the lights down maybe?
I can't, but can somebody
I'm happy to move it.
I don't know how that works. So we have a team of 4 lobbyists that are at the legislature on a regular basis. And those are myself and Megan. I do a lot of work in economic development, taxation, and healthcare. As I mentioned, Megan is really our housing expert, a lot of land use permitting, business incentives. Amy Spears, our Vice President of Tourism, she focuses on what I like to call the fun issues. She gets to do issues about serving beer, liquor laws, those types of things, but also some really nudgy issues for the lodging and restaurant industry, working for tourism funding, those kinds of things. And Chris Kerrigan focuses on economic development as it relates to manufacturing. So we really focus on those two industries, manufacturing and tourism, because they are the biggest industries in our state. So we have a couple of economic development goals that ground us in working toward our mission to advance the Vermont economy. And we work with our sister project called the Vermont Futures Project, and they have set out two goals for economic action over thinking about the future. That is to get Vermont's population from where it is, about 650,000 people, to 802,000 people by 2035. And then the first question is, boy, Betsy, if you bring all those people here, where are they gonna live, right? Well, that's why the second goal is a housing goal to get us to 350,000, which is about 80,000 units from where we are today. So I think setting out those goals is something that we're encouraging the legislature to embrace those goals. They're quite aggressive, we understand that. But like many other things, if you don't have an aspiration, if you don't have a path, you don't have a goal to get there, you're not gonna work toward those things. So we feel like we really need to think about how we are going to do that. And I think when you look at the second bullet here, Lamoille County would need to increase its population of 26,000 by 6,000 people over the next 15 years. So what we really tried to do is break this down for you. And then it adds up to 520 people a year and 280 new houses. The reason we put that out there is so that you, as involved members of the county, can start to think about, okay, so if we need 280 houses a year to meet this goal, if we need to bring this many people, are we on track to do that? How are we doing that? And then our work at the State House is to help make that process a little bit smoother, perhaps incentives, different things, so that the towns and the communities and planning commissions and the RDCs and the chambers can all sort of work to bring that forward. So that's goal. That's what I call aspirational goals. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So our three big priorities are housing, as I mentioned earlier. Megan's going to delve into all three of these issues: business success, building our communities, and then thinking about resiliency and recovery. And we're really starting to think a little bit more about how these weather events, which are going to keep coming, have been coming, and going to keep coming. And yet we're always like, oh my goodness, now what do we do? We don't need to, we can have a plan for that. And so we're going to be getting more involved in that. And we've certainly seen that with businesses in a lot of the towns that were impacted by flooding in July. Many of them still haven't recovered. And interestingly, we were down doing this in Bennington last week. And they're like, yeah, we don't need to talk about that because we were impacted by the flooding. I'm like, yet, right? Like, so good that the Bennington County wasn't really impacted, wonderful, but it's coming to a place near us all at some point, and what that is. So we're going to be focusing on that. So Megan, are you up next?
I think I am.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand it over to Megan. She's going to take you through some of the details, and then this is my warning. When Megan gets done speaking, it's your turn to speak, so be prepared. Certainly think about questions. We want to answer questions that you might have, and if they're not things that we're covering, we have plenty of other issues to discuss. And we've got, as I mentioned, the Lieutenant Governor, the Senator, legislators here to certainly jump in and answer questions if we need to. So great, Megan.
Good morning. It's great to be here with you all, and just a huge thanks to Pat for his partnership with the Vermont Chamber. And I think his members and our members sometimes overlap, but sometimes don't. And so the ability to talk about what's going on in Montpelier, specifically from the business perspective, I think is just a great partnership between the organizations. So as Betsy mentioned, top priority again this year is really looking at, what are we going to do about the housing crisis? And I know some people say like, well, why does the Vermont Chamber want to be talking about housing? Shouldn't you be talking specifically about workforce? Because the two are incredibly interrelated. I don't know how many of you own a business or know business owners who have said, I just lost an employee because they can't find a house nearby and they don't want to drive 2 hours to work. Or I just lost a great prospect who was going to move to Vermont to take a job, bring their family with them, help us meet that 802,000 population goal, but they couldn't find a place to live, so they ended up turning down the job. The housing crisis is directly impacting our ability to become more economically vibrant and keep that vibrancy going. So it's critical for our advocacy that we're continuing to work on that and that we're bringing up the needs of middle income housing as well. That right now we are not doing enough to either make the path clear or invest in housing for middle income workers to live in, as well as that missing middle supply. So missing middle can be used multiple ways, but it's both like, what about duplexes and condos, those places where people can grow into and then grow out of, grow from, or move back into as seniors so they can stay part of our community. We're missing that part of the supply. So if you are moving out of subsidized housing, but you're not ready for that $700,000 house, well, that's all that's on the market. And we hear stories of people leaving to go get family homes in other states. And it's a huge loss for the vitality of our community. So that's really driving what we're talking about. Act 250 is a prime example of one of the issues we want to work on. And I've been on a steering committee all summer and now fall and now winter, talking about how do we modernize Act 250. And the people in that steering committee, the people at the table are conservationists, they're developers, they're economic developers, they're land use or working lands workers. There's a diverse group at the table so that we can really fight it out and say, what matters most to you? What matters most to you? How can we come together? And it's going to be a tough conversation with give and take, but there's a good proposal coming. But what we need now is to take these ideas in policy reform and move it through the political sphere. And that's hard. This is a complicated issue and it's hard to do and it's close to everyone's hearts because it is a landmark land use policy. But just as our communities have changed over the last 50 years, so do our policies that are overseeing how these communities develop. So this is going to be critically important with the study coming out, with conversations that happened last year of saying, we know that housing is a crisis, we know Act 250 is problematic, we're going to deal with it next year when the study comes out. Now is next year, and that work absolutely needs to happen. Investing in those middle income solutions. So there's been a few programs that have been piloted the last couple of years. The Missing Middle Homeownership Development Program is one of those programs that really understood the cost to build a house, right? Because there's not one silver bullet that's going to fix housing. Housing market is challenged by interest rates. It's challenged by the cost of labor, by the cost of materials, and by the cost of permitting, and the availability of labor. So there's a lot of issues. And the Missing Middle Homeownership Development Program went to say, we know there's a gap between what it costs to build middle income housing and what you can sell it for to keep it middle income housing. If it costs you $400,000 to build that house, we can't ask you to sell it for $350,000. So this went to help incentivize developers to build that type of housing and help them reach the gap. And I think it's proved that it's done a really good job of incentivizing housing. And so we're going to be looking for further investment, turning that pilot program into an actual statutory program, and that really focuses on middle income, working with private developers to get that housing need met until we see the market forces change on that. The state designation program, and I assume most towns in Lamoille County are either a designated downtown or a designated village center, have something like that in their community. And when those designations were created, they were created for the purpose of historic tax credits, historic preservation, and downtown tax credits. They weren't created for this is where we want housing. But now that's how they're being used. We had a great housing bill that passed last year, the Home Act, and it said, we're gonna increase the amount of housing that you can put someplace before you trigger Act 250, and it's gonna be in these designated areas. Those designated areas are incredibly small and narrow and not always the best place to put housing. So there's another study, there are 4 studies going on this summer. It's been a very busy summer. That's redesigning how do our designation programs work so that we're designing our communities for the future. So that we're saying putting housing in that floodplain maybe isn't the best idea. We need to work with what's there to become resilient. But when we're building for the future, we need to include areas that allow for future development. So looking at how do we integrate what's happening with Act 250, what's happening with the designation program, to make it really clear for developers and communities to state, this is where we want growth. And that still will help us protect our rural landscape if we are adding those incentives for where we want housing growth. And the last piece that I'll mention is we have a lot of goals in this state. How many houses are we going to weatherize? What's our climate action goal? What's our conservation goal? We know we're in a housing crisis, and we get a housing needs assessment done, and there's a number out there that says, well, this is what it says we need for a number. We don't have a statutory goal that we can hold our housing legislation to. And we saw last year with legislation around climate change that goal that was already in statute kept coming into the conversation of how are we going to reach that goal with this legislation? We need the same thing for housing. We need a housing goal in statute so that when we're working on legislation, that's part of the conversation. Okay, if we redesign designation programs this week, are we going to get to 80,000 units of housing? No, we need to do more. So we're going to be pushing for putting that number in statute. And we are looking at that Vermont Futures Project number, which is driven by data not only of who is in Vermont now, but the homes that we're going to need for the people that we need to be here. The next pillar of our legislative action is around prioritizing business success in Vermont. I know this probably isn't a shock from the Vermont Chamber that we are promoting business success, because we are out in our communities talking to business owners, understanding the work that you're doing in your communities with your employees. And so we are going to be your champions. And it's really critical that the legislature is also your champions, because you are an incredibly important part of our community vitality. And so the first piece of this is we know that as we've made important changes, important increases to our social safety network, that has come with a cost to the business community. As we've reformed or updated corporate tax, we know that's come with an additional cost to the business community. And while the legislature passed a brand new payroll tax last year and changed corporate tax 2 years ago, both of those things are going to be felt and experienced by the business community this year. That's coming in 2024. When you file your taxes for 2023, you'll see that. When the payroll tax starts in July 2024, you'll see that. And so what we're asking is for an understanding of what businesses need time is to absorb what's coming, understand how it's going to impact them. So we need to take a pause on new taxes for new programs and let these cost increases become part of the business model and give time before we're looking at doing something new. So when new proposals are on the table, and they're all for good purposes, we're going to be looking at that piece though and making sure there's an understanding of what's already coming and what we need time to absorb. The next piece is elevating Vermont's achievements. I can't tell you how many times I hear, well, you guys should support this. This is going to be bringing people to Vermont. I'm sorry, how is it bringing people to Vermont? Like, are you telling anybody about it? Well, no. There's this sort of, when you're under the Golden Dome, everyone's talking about the issues. So you sort of assume that everyone outside of the State House is also talking about it, and they're all going to know what you're working on. And that's just not the case. So when we pass historic child care changes, and I'm told this is going to bring people to Vermont, well, if we're not telling anybody outside of Vermont about it, if we're not telling people inside of Vermont about it, it's not going to change our workforce situation. If we're passing incredible climate action goals, and we're not telling people about it, we're not saying in a trade magazine in Florida, hey, we have incredible jobs to do weatherization in Vermont. We have goals that fit your values around climate change. Come to Vermont. We're missing the opportunity to really elevate what it is that we do and why we're special and help meet our workforce challenges. Marketing is not a popular word in the State House. I will tell you that. They don't like marketing. Generally, I will say, not everybody, but generally marketing is not something people like. So call it a campaign, call it elevating achievements, but we need to do more to tell our story, both to Vermonters and to the broader public who are getting, who live the values or want to live the values that we have in Vermont. I love the next line because of where we are. Bolster our CT program. So this is an incredible program that's run in this building. We know 70% of jobs in Vermont don't require a standard 4-year degree. But there are a lot of jobs that require specialized training. And there's so much opportunity for Vermont youth who are not on a path, either, I think a lot of times because that's something that they're choosing is not that path, or that's not the right step for them now for a 4-year degree. But there is incredible opportunity through our CTEs to get trained for high value, in demand careers. And I hate to come back to it. We know there's a study coming out that's going to have recommendations of how we can better support our CTE programs, funding and governance. And we need the legislature to really look at that and look at how we make those changes, because these are incredibly important pathways for students and for our businesses to be gaining the workforce of the future. 2 years ago, the legislature passed a partial exemption on military retirees' pension taxation. Many states fully exempt this. It's exempt federally. This is a workforce who are retiring between 40 and 50. These are people who joined the military in the early 20s. 20 years in, they're retiring with a full pension. They are incredibly diverse. As we're looking at adding population to Vermont, if we are listed as the 48th worst place for military retirees to retire, we have lost the opportunity to be welcoming to that workforce and to retain that workforce of people who have been serving in our National Guard living in Vermont. There are conversations like, well, it's not that much money, but it is incredibly meaningful to that military retiree. And it's an incredible opportunity for Vermont to be attracting workers who are highly skilled, who still have decades left in their work life, and who are coming with a pension already. So this is something we're going to continue to push for and ask for. I think there's a growing coalition, bipartisan, tripartisan, of legislators who support this. It's been on the governor's agenda every year, and it's an important part of this mix of how do we address our workforce crisis. And I'll say the last piece of our 3 pillars are around recovery and resiliency. We know there's still over $100 million of unmet need in our Vermont communities from the economic impact of the flood. We know that there are still people who are struggling with what to do about their housing, who communities are relying on to return, who businesses need to have return, but I understand the struggle that their employees are going through. It's going to be a tough budget year. The state has $100 million in capital expenses from their own loss during the flood, but we're going to be asking for continued support for those businesses that have received economic injury, who have all just come out of COVID, who are up to their eyeballs in debt and can't take on more debt, but who we need to keep our communities thriving. We also know, as Betsy said, these are no longer once in 100 years. We are really feeling the impacts of climate change. And while we work on meeting our goals, we also need to understand we need to be prepared to mitigate and be more resilient. And when you're in the middle of recovering from a flood and you just need to put that flooring down and you just need to get things back open, it can't be the first thing you think about. Well, how do I prepare for this in the future? And so how are we going to work with the federal government to get funding to say, let's help businesses and communities, once they're able to breathe, do that preparation. Put those pieces in place. And again, this all ties back into where are we going to build that future housing? Why do we need new areas to put that in? But looking forward has to be a piece of it. We can't forget what happened in July of this year or Irene 12 years ago. We've seen some of the mitigation impacts or the communities that fared better this time around because of the mitigation work they did. So we need to continue working with communities and businesses on that. And then we need our state agencies to be ready to respond. So Agency of Commerce and Community Development has now stood up a few programs in response to disasters, whether it's a pandemic or a flood. Well, let's standardize so that next time we have that ready to go. It can just be updated and go right to joint fiscal to say we need funding. And every state agency needs to be looking at that. What do we need to be doing in a response? How do we support Pat, who's going to be on the front lines helping businesses and helping communities be ready to go as the event is happening? So that might not take an act of legislation, but it's going to be part of the conversation, and we're going to be at the table to talking about what we're hearing about people's needs so that we can be answering questions as that preparedness is happening. So before I move on, Do you want to should we take questions now and then go back to?
Okay, that's fine. This is where I warned you all. Now your job to talk. I think we've just sort of put out what our agenda is. These are the main things that we're working on. It's in 3 buckets, but there's endless issues. And these are the issues that we are working for. There's certainly issues that are going to come up that we're going to say, whoa, 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 wait a minute on that. So this is your chance. What's on your mind? What did we miss? We think about ourselves as your lobbying team, the business community's lobbying team. And so, it would be helpful too if you've got a question, just, tell me who you are, what your business is, what your group is that you're working with so that we can understand who we're chatting with. So who's brave to be first? Yeah.
I'm Susie Clarity. My son owns Timber Home in Still. I'm hearing about drawing a population in. What I'm not hearing is, what about developing the families and children that already exist? What about giving families an opportunity to keep more of their own money with tax breaks and encouraging the growth of homegrown population?
Yes. So if you didn't hear that, did everybody hear that or not? Okay. She asked about, as we encourage more people to move to Vermont, that's great. What do we do about the Vermonters that are here? How do we keep them here? Specifically through tax breaks, some way that they can keep more of their own money. Did I get that right?
Supporting families, supporting more children born here that will be raised in the culture here.
Yeah.
So that we can keep our Vermont uniqueness, because it's a cultural thing. We know what it's like to have people from other places come in and say, oh, there's bears. Oh, there's
bears.
Where's
There are.
We need
the roads are icy in the morning.
Yeah, don't slip on the ice. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, how are we supporting families that are long-term, been here for generations? I mean, that the housing becomes less important because it's a family and they work things out. And
It's a good question, and I think you're right to bring it up in the sense of, we look at it through the workforce lens. How do we get more people in the workforce? Since the beginning of the pandemic till now, a lot has transpired with people in the workforce and out, but suffice it to say that we're still 20,000 workers short from where we were pre-pandemic. So that is a big gap. We have about 300,000 workers in the workforce in Vermont. We need 20,000 more. So when we're thinking about where do we get those 20,000, the answer to what are we doing to support Vermont families is a very long and involved answer, because we do a lot in Vermont. And I think most recently we can talk about the child care bill that passed last year. I think that was something that a lot of folks felt like really needed to be addressed, and that's for people who are here. We say to the legislature, could you put some marketing money behind it so that not only Vermonters know about it, but people from outside Vermont. If you really think it's going to help change the workforce, you absolutely need to tell somebody about it. We don't do that. We rely on our press, which I believe is a weakened press, but we rely on that to get the word out. That's not enough. But so we can talk a little bit about the child care piece, I think, and talk a little bit about that. But there's a lot of different types of support for Vermonters. I don't think, when you asked about sort of tax breaks and how can we get them to keep more of their own money, like I said at the opening, I've been doing this for a really long time. That conversation is never, I was going to say rarely, but I think I'm confident in saying never on the table. We are not talking about shrinking that piece, because we have so much to do. So, I mean, case in point is the child care bill. If we're going to do something to address child care, where do you get the money for that? Well, it's coming out of your pay stub. It's a payroll tax. Whether that's on the employee, on the employer, that's where the money comes from. So what we're trying to do is figure out, like, understanding that we're not going to be in an environment that can talk about what you want to talk about. What can we do? We can encourage them to not do too much of that taxation in any given year, in any given couple of years, especially as we're dealing with the impacts of the pandemic still for a lot of businesses. Do you want to add something here on families? Or I know, Dan, you've done a lot of work in this area. If anybody else wants to pop up and talk, I just know that there's a long list of programs that we do. I think one other thing that I wanted to mention is a couple of years ago, the state, with our support and a lot of people's support, is we encouraged them to really develop a program to get people to move here. And that answer was, here's $5,000. In the first iteration, it was, here's $10,000 to move here. Here's $5,000 to move here. And that was, for Vermonters, it was like, what about me, right? Sort of that notion. And the what about me answer is this longer answer that the state government does a lot of things for people who are living here, whether that's, help with housing or help with childcare or help with transportation, sort of all of those pieces. This was an effort to try to get others. I think it did what it needed to do. It sort of shook the world, like, wait, what? What's Vermont doing? There was a lot of people who were interested in that. It's not sustainable over the long term, and so that program's not continuing. But I think a lot of people saw that as, well, will you pay me $5,000 to stay here? And I think the answer to that is there are all these other state programs that we are paying for Vermonters. So that's a partial answer. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and add anything there.
I have a question.
Sure.
Nicole Audio, great new graphics. I'm also the chair of the Lamoille County Republican Committee. It sounds like there's a lot of data, a lot of studies that you guys are pulling from, and that's amazing. I'm curious, the 20,000 workers that we're short right now, and this is a new phenomenon, I think I'm hearing since like COVID times maybe. What is the main driving reason? Is it people left the state, or is it people are just choosing not to work because it's easier that way?
It's a lot of things. A big amount of that, probably about a third of that, at the height of the pandemic, that number was 30,000. We're now at 20, so that means a bunch of people have come back into the workforce. But at the height, that number, we saw about 10,000 people leave the workforce due to retirement is, I would say, aging out of the workforce. The reason I sort of hedge on the word retirement is people stepped off of the 40-hour-a-week job, retired, and might be picking up work, but they're not in the traditional workforce. If they're picking up work, their numbers will show up. So that is a big portion of it. What happened with the other 20,000 is a real mix. And we also are seeing folks doing work in different ways. That is, part-time, seasonal type work. Those will show up when the data comes out on that piece. But we're missing those 20,000 people. And I think one of the things that we look at with our demographics and our population, we look at migration. And there's been a lot of stories over the last 3 or 4 years about all these people moving into Vermont, buying up houses, and Vermont's safe, and it's a great place to ride out the pandemic, and sort of all of those conversations. We don't see all the stories about the people who left Vermont. And yet we all know those people because they're our neighbors. So that net migration in is a very, very, very small number, 92 to be exact. So when you hear all those stories, you have to look at that number. So where did everybody go? I'm not exactly sure. I am confident in that 1/3 of it is that retirement number. Yeah.
When you commented about the population shift, I thought I just heard a story, it was out very recently, about the increase of Vermont's population over the last few years is more than like the last 2 decades.
That's true.
Okay, so we are increasing the population.
There's 2 different numbers. So the people coming to Vermont is greater than has been over the last decade. What I was talking about was that net migration. So there are people coming and there are people leaving. And so that net number is small.
Yeah, I was under the impression that the data they were talking about was the net change, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'd be glad to send some backup information from what I'm quoting from, because we do have that data. And, you know, I saw a story the other day that number was 3,000 net, and that was taking like different years. Both are correct. It's just looking at that. My point is, it's a small amount over a course of a decade, so we.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, and the other thing to think about too is we're kind of talking about workforce, and a lot of that influx of
Yes.
people were
People.
out of the workforce. They
People.
were older folks, let's say. So a large portion of that is not helping our economy in terms of workforce.
And the other place they don't show up when they come in is the remote work piece. You know, we're measuring Vermont workforce. So you might be here, you might be working for some other company. You're not in our workforce, you're in the workforce. And you had a follow-up?
Yeah, just to follow up in terms of, originally you quoted some data, some information about what the goal was, the population increase in Lamoille County, I think it was 6,000 number, and that the housing units were 280
A year.
a year.
A year.
The
Okay.
6,000 was for the 15 years,
That explains.
not 6,000 a year.
Yeah.
You want 6,000 a year? Are you ready for that?
No.
I didn't think so. We were talking over a longer period of time. Okay. Yeah.
Can I stand?
You can stand.
Because if there are people as hard of hearing as I am, I'll do the show. I'm Jeff Lindemer. I've lived in Stowe for 38 years, and I did something on Tuesday that I've never done in 38 years, and that's vote against school funding program. So one issue is that the burden of repaying that debt falls on the primary homeowners and not the second homeowners. And I might be a little bit off on this, but there were too few people to repay the debt, and that was the reason I voted against it. And so I think that the way the laws are written, the burden's falling on the primary homeowners, and there's too few of them, and especially in Stowe, it's going in the wrong direction because the price of housing is going up and people can't afford to live there. And the reason, I'm semi-retired, and one of the reasons I'm semi-retired is so I can afford to continue living in Stowe. The second piece of that is I talked to a friend yesterday who's a generation younger than I am. He has an 8-year-old daughter, and he said his plan is 10 years. He's got a 10-year plan. She turns 18, then his options are open to him. We've put our kids through school. We've benefited from the program. And we can move out if we want, but because of the housing market, we can't afford to move out. We can sell, but we can't buy. So those are two issues: is the paying for the debt and being able to afford to live there. So affordable housing is a key piece of it. And it's not that I'm opposed to education spending, because I know how important that is. The last issue is that I'll get to it. I'm having a seat moment.
It's fine. You've already put 2 healthy issues on our plate. You can think of that third one.
All right,
Education finance is not a.
The third issue is that, I know, is I have never heard anybody talk about addressing the builders of affordable homes. I'm not a builder, but if I were a builder, I would much rather build a $1 million home than a $350,000 home, because of the regulations are essentially the same and the margins are much higher on the $1 million home. So as part of this Act 250, all this kind of stuff, somebody needs to address incentivizing builders to build affordable homes.
And that's what the missing middle homeownership development pilot program was aimed at, is saying, because we know there are builders, because we've talked to them, who have said, I wanna do the right thing for my community. Excuse me. I wanna build housing for middle income workforce, because I know that's missing. But I can't take a loss. Like, I'm not going to lose $50,000 on a home if I build it for $400,000 and I can sell it for $600,000. It's really hard for you to tell me I need to sell it for $350,000. So that program was aimed at how do we help developers that can get into that middle income home ownership market, who are willing to participate in that. How do we help them bridge that gap? And I think the Vermont Housing Finance Agency is going to be bringing back some data on this program's been going on for 2 years. How's it going? And then, if it's going well, what are the tweaks we need to make? And then how do we scale it? Because we know this is an issue. But there's no one silver bullet for housing. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed in order for that builder of little a affordable, that's making housing affordable for everybody regardless of your income. How do we take the barriers out of the way to meet this crisis where it's at?
Senator Westland?
So I usually try not to speak about myself, but I'm going to do that. One, it's way too simplistic to talk just about activity. I, with a 24-year-old partner, have 11 acres of land and we're trying to develop it to do some moderate income rental housing. I had to go to 3 engineering firms, and the first question they asked was, were you going to go through Act 250? And if we answered the question that we wanted to go through Act 250, so we hit the 10-unit mark, they didn't want anything to do with this. So I can't find an engineer. It isn't really Act 250. And I keep hearing this from the administration. We need to shorten the time for the application for Act 250. It's the engineering getting there that is a nightmare. And coupled with that now, what we've done is we've lowered the stormwater regulations, and we cut that number more than in half. So if you have impervious surfaces now of over a half an acre, and we've done all of that in the last 24 months. So coupled with Act 250, you have to go through these stormwater regulations. So even if you get the cap raised for Act 250, you're not going to be able to build because of impervious surfaces. So I think it's a package of things that have to come together. It can't be that we keep throwing in the air what Act 250 is asking for is bad, because not everything Act 250 asks for is bad. But coupled with everything else, and coupled with the fact that we haven't got enough engineers out there doing the work, you can't get through the process.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's why this steering committee that's working on Act 250 has stakeholders from every different segment of advocacy talking about it, so that we can say, so that we're at the table with VNRC, with the Vermont Natural Resource Council, saying, what are you seeing as the issues? And they're asking what we're seeing as the issues. And we're coming together to say, how do we make this work better? Because if you're building 9 units here and then 5 miles later, you're building 9 units there in order to avoid Act 250, then it's not working. And it is important, but we need to, part of this is reputational. And I was doing a presentation to 100 developers yesterday about this, and the stories that they tell of, if I am in Lamoille County, there's one set of expectations for a statewide program. If I go to Bennington County, it's an entirely separate set of expectations. If I go to Rutland County, completely different. And so it's a statewide program that is being run differently around the state. So if you have a developer who's going to different parts of the state, they're saying it doesn't work. And then you get engineers who are like, I don't want to touch that. I'm not going to be part of that process. So if the engineers are saying no because of Act 250, then there's something in Act 250 that isn't working. It does good
Well,
work.
there's not enough engineers out.
There's not enough anybody, not enough snowplow drivers, there's not enough correctional officers, there's not enough anything. I want to be really clear about the Vermont Chamber's position on Act 250 and permitting. You're absolutely right. It's multifaceted. Our advocacy about Act 250 is looking at where we can build, where those designation areas are, and allowing us to build in more areas. It is not about gutting Act 250. It is not about making sure that it is about making sure we still have strong environmental protections. We want to go through the Act 250 process. We just want to do it quicker and build more housing to answer this thing.
Even if you do that now with stormwater regulations.
You have stormwater, we're looking at, in the negotiations with the environmental groups, they want to have a road rule to limit the amount of, road space that you can have to any new development. These are all conversations that are part of the whole. So what we're trying to do is preserve Act 250 where it is in some ways, make some adjustments so that we can get to build more housing. Every elected leader in the state, regardless if they are a progressive, an independent, a Republican, or a Democrat, they say to us, housing. The Speaker of the House last year was quoted in the very first day of the legislative session. In her opening speech, she said, "My number one priority is housing, housing, housing." We agree. But we don't have that aspirational goal, and we need to do something. And we believe that the legislature is doing a lot of good work addressing the homelessness crisis, putting a lot of money into how we shelter the unhoused. They're looking at putting money into the affordable subsidized housing, because that's where you can put money. We could get the private sector working on this too if we could figure out some of the conundrum that you put up.
One more and I'll shut up. If I do a unit on 800 square foot apartment, and I build a 4,000 square foot home, they're counted the same.
Mm-hmm. That's an issue, right? Yeah.
Can I jump in on it?
Yeah.
For fear of, not getting out of here alive, I would admit that I'm on the Act 50 Commission for our area, so we have some very familiar. I won't mention that Nicole is too. But anyway, the reason why I bring that up is because Act 250 is sort of always gets the rap. Well, it's Act 250, it's Act 250. And Rich is absolutely right. It's not just Act 250. The environmental stuff is as equal of a problem as Act 250 can be in terms of the barriers. And the two of them depend on each other and play off each other constantly. So it's not just Act 250, even though we talk about that a lot. But what I would say is there's things that are created by men and women, and there's things that are created by the conditions of the world around us. And Act 250 and environmental laws are created by men and women, which means we can do something about that. There's also things like the pandemic sent the cost of goods flying sky high. That wasn't really arguably created by people. It was something that was out of our control nonetheless. So there's things within our control and things that are not within our control. So what do we focus on?
Well, that Vermont Housing Finance Agency last year put in a program that has $10 million that buys down interest rates. The difference between an 8% interest rate and a 5% interest rate on if you've got a loan of $700,000 is about $1,400 a month. $1,400 a month can break you.
Well, and that comes back to, it all circles back to housing with the conversation, because the bottom line is the cost of living is too high. Jeff mentioned earlier, he's at retirement stage and he can't really retire because he can't afford to live here with his situation. I've got a son who's 17 years old and his friends are graduating from high school and they want to stay in Vermont. They're Vermonters and they want to stay here. But when they go to work, they can't afford to get an apartment and live. They cannot afford, so what are they doing? I'm gonna move to North Carolina because there's jobs and houses, So a lot of it circles back to the housing. Even the people who want to stay here can't stay here, or they've got to find these creative ways to figure it out.
And I will say, coming back to, is it Sarah? Susie? Sorry, Susie, your question. The legislature has done some great things to try and keep people here. It's, there is a difference in that sort of philosophy of should we decide what to do with your money or should you decide what to do with your money? But some of the things they're deciding to do with your money are really great, and they are retention. But we're not elevating those achievements. We're not framing it. So the national news picks up, Vermont's paying $10,000 for people to move there, and everyone's thinking about it. And they're like, well, what about me? There's a lot of money invested in how do we invest in Vermonters, but it's not being framed well as this is our retention package. If you want to be a nurse, we're going to help pay for that. Don't go out of state and pay college to be a nurse. You can go to college here, and we're going to pay you to be a nurse. And then when you graduate college here, if you take a job here, if you did have any loans, we're going to forgive some of those loans. So I think there are great things, and we try and put that information out. We're a small team of 12 people, though. We can't do all the marketing of here's the legislative retention package, and that's not going to get the splashy media coverage that moved $10,000. But we do need to do a better job of telling that story so that when these good programs are passed by your legislative team, it is being framed in a way of and this is what we've done to help you keep your family in Vermont.
We've got a couple of questions building up. Here, you had a question, and then here.
Yeah, not so much a question, I guess, but Dave McAllister, I'm the CEO of Lamoille Youth and Family Services. We're one of the largest employers in the county. I would say a couple of things regarding workforce. One is the benefits cliff is something that for decades has sort of perpetuated some of the challenges. I think looking at that and figuring out a way to realistically be able to supplement folks. I think there's a lot of people that are skilled and talented and would make incredibly dedicated employees who are sort of on that point where they say, I can't afford to work, so I need to go and let the state take care of it. And so how do we figure out how to offer what people need to take care of themselves or their families and still allow them to be a contributing asset to an employer, to their community, et cetera. I think number two, in the lobbying effort, I think that we need to convince the state that employers are motivated to take care of their employees and that they will do that. Continuing to be forced to do things for our employees, one, it takes away the opportunity where we can reinvest in those people the right way or the way that's going to make the biggest impact to them. And number two, it also gives us a competitive disadvantage to the things that we are offering to our employees that set us apart from our competitors. And so I would really encourage folks to double down with people around that. I think the other thing, Lamoille is a children's mental health educational organization, and what I would say is this is well before the pandemic, but at our highest point in 2010, we had 188 employees. We're down to about 120. And that decline started well before the pandemic. If you look at, I'm a school board member, if you look at the interested number of people that want to enter child-serving organizations, child-serving fields, that has been on the decline for over a decade. And so I think just like nursing, just like anything else, if we want people to move into fields or studies that are dedicated towards improving children and children's lives, then we need to figure out what are some of those incentives. And are there student loan forgiveness programs that we can offer? Maybe it's an employer match thing, right? So an employer can match a certain amount. There's a state fund that will help, match the other part. Again, that's benefiting employees. It's benefiting employers who are, hiring those folks, and it benefits the state because we're keeping people here and contributing in a lot of different ways, not just economically, but one of the things I love about Vermont is we are people who are giving to our community. So you talk about like the volunteerism that exists in Vermont. There's people right now with the recovery stuff. There's people running out there on weekends, going door to door, asking people what they need, helping people. You know, those are things that are not showing up in workforce data. They're not showing up, but you got to have people here in order to benefit the community in that capacity. So I would just say, in terms of a lobbying effort, thinking about that stuff. Last thing I'll leave you with, I was at a meeting on Friday, and I heard the national unemployment numbers at 3.8%. Vermont's at 1.9.
Yep.
And that we only currently have 2,000 people that are claiming any sort of unemployment insurance. So this notion that like people are just sitting home and collecting money is not true. That is
correct.
And so again, it's that notion of where are people and how do we get them here and invest in what we need.
Yeah, and gosh, you said it better than any of us have. So absolutely, and I think we'll take that message to the legislature, because we don't hear enough about the good work that employers do. When you talk to most legislators, they can cite like, this business in my town does this great thing, and everybody does that, but it doesn't seem to rise up when we're talking about things that we can do to them, or I think your words was force them to do. So I hear you on that for sure. And you're right about the numbers. This is why we say, yes, we need to retain the people who are here, but there's not enough of us. I might get this number, the exact number wrong, but I believe there are only 5,000, maybe 5,000 first graders in Vermont, in the entire state. Hello? Okay, that's your workforce.
I've got one of them, so.
You have one of them, well, thank you. But that number is so tiny. So, you know, they're in first grade. In a decade or so, they're going to be in the workforce. And you're going to be saying there's not enough people to hire. So yes, we have to do everything to keep every one of those 5,000 people here. But you know, getting 100% of anything is really tough. So we also, in addition to that, have to figure out how we encourage people to make Vermont home. Yeah.
I have several questions.
Oh, good.
Morna Flom, Johnson resident. I also own a business. I'm also trying to bring my little family up from North Carolina. My son and daughter-in-law have both been in healthcare for 8 years at the lower level, but they have 2 tiny children. And it's really stressful to try and figure out housing that is not going to be disgusting and gross and overpriced, because it's painful. And like, if there were one, I believe in creativity and I believe in engineering. I believe that we probably already could figure out solutions, but is there any such thing as emergency movable housing that can sustain itself in the winter and not be a blight on the land forever? So they come, they land, they have their space, their security for their children, so that it's not like in a drug and violence park, you know. And then is there an omnibus kind of way to access the extra training and the career support for people who do want to make a difference? And then is there such a thing or such an idea as like a land trust for affordable housing? Like we have
like
wonderful land trusts. I totally believe in our land. I really do. But could there be some kind of offsetting for people who maybe have 89 acres and they want to have a benefit and donate 9 acres to, you know, have half-acre plots instead of these things on top of each other? And that's too many questions, and I apologize.
Yeah, that kind of creativity is needed. Okay, so don't apologize.
Okay.
It's great. There's a couple of answers to your question. Do you want to talk a little bit about the movable units and where to get help? Or one place I would suggest they go right away is there's a thinkvermont.com website. And the notion is, if you're thinking about moving to Vermont, go here. It's like the entry portal. There's a place that if you're a business, you go this way. If you're a person, you go this way. Okay. There's job information, housing information. It's like a portal to all of government. So I would start there with where do they go to find all these things? There's been a lot of work, and I'm not the expert on this, ADUs and accessory
Yeah.
dwelling units and allowing people to build either housing or temporary housing on their land already. I don't know if I'm not an expert on that, but yes, that's been happening.
So the Home Act last year, which was the big housing bill, had some state pieces in it, but I also looked at what's happening on the on the local level that is prohibiting the building of housing, and where does the state need to interject and say, you know what, having an ADU doesn't significantly change things. You can't ban it. You can't say, an accessory dwelling unit. So it's adding, whether you've got a carriage home or a barn on your property and you want to make that a rental unit, or part of your basement you want to make into a rental unit. And it's part of the VHIP, with a silent R, Vermont Rental Housing Investment Program. It really is aimed at rental units, so that ADU, if you're creating an accessory dwelling unit as on your land or in your home, there's money to help you do that.
And in the past, there has been, in certain
There's still
towns,
money to help you do that? The ADU?
and in certain towns,
Yeah.
it's not been allowed, or they could not allow it, and so this language says we're going to promote that. So we can, perhaps afterwards, I think we can get you some information on that.
And it would also say, if there's a rental unit that's been condemned, or it's not up to code, you can apply for money to put money in, make those improvements so that it can become a rental unit again. And we know that blighted properties are a big issue. If you have to spend $400,000 to buy a house, and then you need to spend another $200,000 in order to live in it, that becomes unaffordable. So there might be some of those homes that hit that middle income price tag, but not to actually live in it. So that's part of what needs to be addressed as well.
One other piece that I wrote down that I didn't mention, and that is, we are an aging state.
Yes,
And
yes, I think we know
when
that.
people get older, they can't do all the stuff they need to do for themselves.
Yes.
And I've seen this, caring for elderly family members. Like down in the New York area, there are free-range old people. I'm sorry, I'm almost one of them. But
I don't know if anybody heard that term, free-range old people. I've never heard that term before.
well, like I said, I'm creative. But it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
And if we,
Well, and this is why we encourage
stay in their
you,
homes.
if there's one thing you do when you leave here with the notion of, I am going to be open to having more people live in Vermont, because who's going to take care of me when I'm old, among other things. And I'm going to be open to having more housing where I can see it in my community. Yes, it takes time for all of these things to happen, but part of the thing that's not legislated is us, right? Like, yes, I want housing. Oh, but like, not right here. Or the same thing with people. Yes, I want to welcome more people. But let's not do that yet, because we don't have any place to put them or whatever. We have to do many, many things. So I'm just cognizant of the time.
I saw Dan and Lieutenant Governor, and then maybe we can close it out there.
Sure.
We are at
Just
time.
quick, speaking of older Vermonters, we really need to figure out how we're going to provide housing for older Vermonters in our village centers and downtowns outside the floodplain.
Of course.
Because I think that will take a lot of the pressure off the middle housing, because people are not going to leave their home if they have no place to go, as we've heard from Jeff and many others today. And we tried to prioritize that with the S100 around wastewater and access to wastewater, but the Vermont Age Strong Plan is just coming out next week, as they're having a big kickoff for it, and it really does try to prioritize housing for older Vermonters as a way to take some of the pressure off.
It's a good thought, because those of us that have families who were young at once and have moved on are living in big houses. Maybe there's only one or two of you in that house, but if there's no place for you to go, you're not going to vacate that house for a family. So yeah, and Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you. troubling to think relative to what Richie said in terms of square footage. Are you looking at that, whether it's Act 250 or other laws, of saying why the number of units as opposed to the space? Because you could build a lot of 800 to 1,200 foot housing.
Yeah.
For small families. The second piece was I didn't hear you mentioning the both second home ownership rate, because we're either first or second time in Maine, more or less, at 16%, I think, of residential properties in Vermont are second homes, as you know, but still, obviously. And in particular, there's a lot of work trying to be done for years around understanding short-term rentals and long-term rentals for, our kids to go out and live in Vermont. They're usually not maybe quite ready to buy at 19 and 23. But a lot of long-term rentals seem to have been, but it's all anecdotal, we don't know, shifted to short-term, which is part of that tourism economy that you were talking about. So are you, what's your thought on some of that research that's needed?
I'm gonna be quick because we're close on time, but I will say the Act 250 study, what's being proposed is in our downtowns and in our village centers, in the larger downtowns, elimination of Act 250. That if you're in that zone, you don't come under it, because that's where we want to build, and those zones will already have local robust permitting regulations. In our village centers, we're moving unit size. To your point, why are we limiting units? If we're trying to encourage density, there'll still be a lot size of more than 10 lots, more than 6 lots, whatever it is now, depending on where you are. That'll still be in place, but the units piece is removed. And again, we're doing that in concert with conservationists and environmental groups to come to that conclusion. So yes, that is very much in discussion and will be brought in, hopefully, in the report. And then the other piece on short-term rentals, this is a piece that we have lobbied on for years, and the legislature has passed for years.
And the governor has
vetoed
for years.
To say we need to understand what the issue is. Can we get a short-term rental registry to see where are these short-term rentals? What kind of units are they in? Are we talking about homes that could be for Pat's son? Or are we talking about a ski condo that, we need more data to understand it. And actually the Short-Term Rental Alliance has been on board with that as well. Because I think we need to understand. And we also need to have a hard conversation about, what might be causing a long-term rental to become a short-term rental. What's going through the owner's mind there. But that's a piece that, and as we see piecemeal around the state, towns dealing with it in different ways, it becomes a struggle from that traveling public of why does it cost more here and not there? So, that's a conversation we're going to continue to have and really look at what's going on around the state.
And with H100, I know there was hope for a lot more change with Act 250, but there still was a lot of change with respect to essentially the state taking over control on some aspects of zoning. We more or less doubled the number of units in the state, right? Because any single unit on a property can now be a duplex or ADU, and in place of water and sewer, I think it's 4 times. So do you see that opening a lot of doors towards adding on units, whether it's for our aging?
So the opportunity, I think there's an opportunity for our existing supply to say, or for if you want to build a duplex, that a town can't say you can't build a duplex. So there's opportunity there. When we look at VHFA's data on how many permits have been pulled, they're projecting less units getting built next year than this year.
So you talk about marketing what we do.
Right.
So
I feel like we should have a statute that says if you're going to do something, 10% of the appropriation should go to our marketing, whatever good thing we
letting everyone know.
Nobody knows what we like. I know, and it takes a while for it to get out. But my point is, you're doing good things in the legislature. Let's tell people about it. I'm just cognizant of the time. We're going to be here afterwards if you have individual questions. I'd like to just thank Representative Dan Noyes for being here, Representative Jedlinsky, Senator Rich Westman, Lieutenant Governor Dave Zuckerman. Thank you all for being here. Pat, thank you for having us. We really appreciate this conversation.
Thanks everybody for braving the roads, and there are some brown bags there. I see a lot of pastries, so please take something home.
Where did they come from? They're delicious.
Great, thank you very much.